Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter. With me today is a very special guest, Isandering Person. Uh, well, let's tell people a little bit about who you are after you. So, Isandering, hi, how are you?
Hey, how's it going? I guess I've been lurking around different little groups for a couple of years now, I guess. And I just like to poke fun at people.
Well, and
Just,
I was going to say, I think I've known you for, I was going to say a year. It's probably not quite that much, maybe about 8 months or so. But, you've been a big supporter of the show. And when you have time, you would come by into the Discord and would talk a lot. And I gained a lot of respect for your positions. We don't actually usually disagree by all that much. I think we sort of take a look at a lot of the same things and go a little different ways with it. But I think you're one of the few people who I do disagree with on a number of issues, but who I always felt I learned something when we had our discussions, and I've always found your views to be really quite well thought out and based in fact. Not, as of yet, I haven't found an opinion of yours that I think you held just because, for emotional reasons, I should say. So,
my guns.
my guns, except for guns. I know. You got 5 of them. You sleep with one under each arm, one under each leg, and one under the pillow. But we'll get to that.
Oh God, no, that'd rust them too much.
Well,
they've got their own
altar.
little holsters just strategically placed around me. They surround my bed.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, and I started with sound. We started basically on time. The world is changing, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry to say. So, and now you had watched the gun debate between Ansgar and myself, and
Yes.
you
Screaming at the screen many times.
Yeah. So, well, and then you had wanted to actually have a discussion with me, and then we had sort of tried to schedule it, and you got very busy, then I got very busy, and so here we are now, 6 to 8 months later, finally having our discussion. So one thing I do want to do,
And
yeah, please.
go ahead.
No, you
it's
go.
like, yeah, one of the things was, and when it first happened, there had been a couple of shootings, I think, and it seemed really prescient at the time when you had the debate. And when I first said, yeah, I'd like to talk with you, like we had that after show, and I got to talk with both you and Ansgar about it. And then a little bit of time went by, and thinking, well, this idea is kind of sort of faded from public life, which it kind of does from time to time. It since I really believe that most of the hype around it is media driven. I mean, they focus on things that should be covered in media, but then it's just wall-to-wall coverage. They incense everybody, and gun violence is not the epidemic people think that it is. If you listen to the media, so it was. I really wanted to talk to you about that, and then it can get very difficult setting things up between different people. So I think it's come a little bit more prescient again, given what's been going on recently.
Well, I think the obviously both what's been happening in terms of a lot of the protests, the Black Lives Matter, and the objection to armed police officers in general. I think that's one reason why it's come forward. And my suspicion is because of the lockdowns across the country, I think what we're finding is people haven't been talking about it, and we haven't had as many mass shootings, or at least the really big ones that end up on the news. The schools have been closed, so there hasn't been a school shooting. The the Las Vegas shooter went into a hotel and shot from the 22nd floor. The all those places are closed, and there isn't huge gatherings, so you're not going to see the kind of violence that really plays well in the news and that they use to that galvanizes this kind of thing. So what we have is, but now I think we're going to start seeing it again, at least until there's a second lockdown, which I've really, at this point, no doubt is coming.
Yeah, the reader boards along the side of the highways now, they're starting to have a lot more strongly worded things instead of the little cute chintzy sayings. Keep your distance on the highway and in person. Well, now they're putting up things like masks required in all public spaces. And, they're not trying to be cute about it anymore. So yeah, there's seems a lot more serious.
I hope it is, and this is something we're going to do a news update. We've been collecting a lot to discuss, and I do apologize that I'm actually distracted right now. We got disconnected from the live chat, so I am attempting to reconnect our back end to it. But the Florida.
Yes, I have to look down at the live chat.
So Florida, 41 hospitals in Florida. Their ICUs and, in fact, the hospitals in general are at capacity. That represents 21 counties in Florida, which can't handle any more patients. And obviously, they're going to get more. They're going to get a lot more. This is just beginning for Florida. And so it's nice that some are starting to take it seriously. But, yeah, it's a problem. Texas is not quite as bad as Florida, but they will be soon. And I think Arkansas, elements of California are starting to get there. So it's unfortunate, but I think it's interesting because, of course, you're one of the few people who really is still, you're on the road and you're going everywhere. So you're seeing this. So you're saying that the mood has changed?
Yeah, I think so. You're going to places, and like I don't know, a couple months ago to even to just a month ago, you didn't have a mask or something. They didn't really say anything to you. You'd see some people. Well, now they're saying things to you, and you show up to some of these places like shippers and receivers, and they'll walk up to you with a mask if you like. I've gotten out of my truck to try and do something, wasn't paying attention, didn't put on a mask or anything, and they'll walk up to me holding a mask, and I've got like 20 of these things now, the little hospital mask. So yeah, it's. Like I said, the reader boards aren't being so cute about it anymore. They're saying mandatory, face mask use from public areas. So yeah, and I'm seeing that all over the place too. Arizona is requiring it, Colorado requires it, Utah requires it. So they're all on the rear board saying it's required, and now all the truck stops, all of everything has got the sign saying, mask use required.
All right. Well, so let's talk the Second Amendment a bit. And I think what we're going to do here,
well-regulated militia.
Oh, here we go.
You have a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We might as well start with what the actual amendment says.
All right. Let's start with what the amendment says. Yeah.
It's interesting.
My argument is nobody knows what any of those words mean.
Okay. Earlier today, there was a active shooter in 29 Palms Marine Base in California. I'm not entirely sure what that person. That is a definition of mentally disturbed, because I have no idea what you're thinking if you're going to go take a weapon to a Marine base and try and shoot it up. I mean, that's the entire goal of all Marines, is to have the biggest, baddest, and most powerful weapon in the world. So I don't know what he was thinking. Apparently, there were no injuries. They did apprehend him. They had him. So I was hearing secondhand reports of it while I was driving.
So all right, I hadn't even caught that one. Like I said, I've been trying to keep up with the COVID thing. Yeah, there's other breaking news, unfortunately, with the COVID, including they now think it's airborne. Not that it has now become airborne, but that it's always been airborne. So it's not like a new thing, but if it's airborne, that also changes how social distancing has to be done, and there's consequences. But we're going to do a show on that. So what does the Second Amendment? So a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary for the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. What does that mean to you?
The first part of, I mean, because I've gone through and read many of the letters and the supporting documentation around the writing of the Constitution from the founders, many letters back and forth, the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, the position of the founders, who didn't even think this needed to be mentioned. They didn't think they needed this. I'm kind of glad that they ended up putting the Bill of Rights in, but at the time when this was being written, these were evidently true things, and they didn't think they actually needed to be spelled out, but they did. They all believed the second half of that amendment: the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. They like poetry in their writing, and they tried to make their writing elegant and flow well. And so simply stating in one of the amendments, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, especially after the First Amendment, which was very elegantly written, didn't jive so well. So they put a exemplary clause. Here's our biggest reason why we think that the American people should be armed. And at the time, of course, they didn't have police, they didn't have the FBI, they didn't have local, the way that the states defended themselves were local militias. That was the force. Then they were made up of the general population. I believe 18 to 32, all men were required to be available for militia service, which included your own equipment. And we also need to keep in mind the language of the time. What did regulate mean? To regulate something or to keep regular. It meant to keep regular, not necessarily add a whole bunch of rules and restrictions on something. I mean, that usage was still there, but it's very clear what usage they intended with to keep regular. Because they wanted the militia to be functional, so they wanted them to have good quality weapons. They wanted to have good quality training, so that if they needed to be called up, they wouldn't be a hazard on the battlefield. So that's generally my understanding of the Second Amendment and what it was meant and what it actually says. Of course, some people argue about the commas and saying that instead of being an exemplary clause, that it's a qualifying clause, that in order for the right of the people to keep and bear arms to apply to the people, they'd have to be first be in a militia, except that the clause says the right of the people specifically instead of the right of militias to keep and bear arms. I mean, that second part of the amendment is incredibly clear. I mean, I would argue the most clear amendment of the first 10, because it's very short, very concise, and it's clear that the founders intended for the American people at the time to be equally armed as to that of the standing army, so that the federal government couldn't use the standing army against the American people. A lot of things have changed since then, and unfortunately, I don't believe they've gone through the correct steps of amending that particular part of the Constitution, that amendment, to reflect the modern times that we're in. Instead, just passing fiat laws that violate the Second Amendment and then fight it out in courts, which are becoming more and more political.
What are some of the changes that needed to be made?
As more and more advanced weaponry came in, especially towards World War I, early 1900s, with chemical warfare. As soon as chemical warfare became somewhat viable and then was actually used in war, they really needed to step up and propose an amendment to the Constitution to prohibit private individuals from owning weapons of such magnitude, of weapons of mass destruction. I believe those were pretty much the first real weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. And they should have stepped up and added the modifier, seeing where technology was going, saying, hey, we're starting to get some weaponry that the military possesses that really shouldn't be in the hands of private citizens. And they should have amended the Constitution back in the early 1900s. And instead, it wasn't until the mid-1920s that we got our first, Congress passed a bill, National Firearms Act, and and instead of actually going through and doing the correct way, because especially in the early 1900s, there was zero support. There's not much more support now for amending the Second Amendment. There's a vocal minority that wishes to do it, but there isn't. The reason they haven't done it, and the reason that they just keep passing laws and fighting it out in courts instead of actually trying to get an amendment passed, is there's just not enough support for it. They wouldn't be able to get an amendment passed. And I think that they should, because there are certainly weapons out there that I agree that no private individual should be possessing and carrying around with them. Thermonuclear devices being one of them.
Okay, so you're just a little less crazy than I was painting you as for other people. For those of you who said that, I thought I was going to open with that, so I apologize. Well, I think you're right that there isn't any stomach for. First of all, I think you and I had this agreement as well too, which is I think neither of us are particularly big fans of the arguments, even on our own side. At least the arguments that are commonly being put forward by our own side. So you're more for the Second Amendment, I'm more against it, but there are plenty of arguments that my side uses that I really kind of abhor. I think they're disingenuous, and I don't. I think if we're going to argue this, we have to argue it the right way, and I think you seem to feel the same way on that.
Oh, absolutely. I cringe at many pro Second Amendment arguers that are, and one that irritates me probably the most is, criminals are already breaking the law. They're not going to follow the law. So why in the hell would we pass a law that they're just going to break? And it's like, well, then why do we have any laws at all? I mean, why do we have a law against murder? I mean, murderers are going to go murder somebody, whether you made it a law or not. So why do we have the law? I hate that argument. Hate it.
Yeah, I'm honestly not a fan of that argument either, for I think roughly the same reasons. Well, and of course, the argument is made about guns in general anyway, which is, well, a criminal's a criminal, so why do you need to? Well, no, what we should do is just leave it that criminals can't use guns, and that when somebody uses a gun in a crime, they're already a criminal. You don't need to criminalize guns. The act isn't the carrying the gun; it's committing the crime. So you don't need to make what is it, armor-piercing rounds on an AR-14 illegal, because if it's being used in a crime, they're already committing the crime. You don't need to tag onto that the fact that they actually got the gun. And of course, that's not the point of making it illegal, or at least harder to get. So I think we're in some agreement with that. I don't think you're going to see any push for to argue. So one argument that the left does use a lot is, well, a lot of people want to get rid of the Second Amendment. That simply isn't true. A lot of people do want stricter gun control. 60% want stricter gun control. 20% of the remaining say the gun control is roughly where it should be, and 20% want to have fewer restrictions on guns. So the amount that actually wants to make guns more available is a minority. They obviously aren't going to be able to change the Second Amendment in any direction to assist them, and there just isn't, even with the 60% that do want more gun control. That 60%, most of them aren't talking about repealing the Second Amendment. They're not saying, well, gee, you have to get rid of it completely, but come on, you shouldn't be able to get guns so easily in this country. And I think the NRA is a huge problem, and in fact does themselves a disservice here, because a lot of the arguments that they use, I think, makes it harder to talk about common sense solutions to the gun problem, because they will end up actually making decent arguments and then doing the exact opposite. It was Wayne LaPierre, while he was vice president of the NRA, who testified before Congress and said that he was for restricting guns from. Actually, let me see if I can get the specifically what it was that he had said here. He said, quote, "I think it's reasonable to provide mandatory instant background checks at every sale, at every gun show. No loophole for anyone. Now, what he was talking about there was the gun show loophole, which I think you know what that is. Most people know what that is. Now, the NRA's position is that there is no loophole. And the argument that they use, and an NRA lawyer, David Kopel, used this argument, which was, well, there's no loophole because everybody in gun shows have to follow the same laws as everybody else everywhere in the country when it comes to the national laws regarding guns. Well, yeah, that's true, but that's a loophole. Isn't that they don't have to follow the laws? The loophole is they found a way around the laws, and the gun show loophole obviously exists. And Wayne LaPierre acknowledged it there, despite later saying it doesn't exist, and the NRA shortly after this strongly opposing any background checks of any kind, even the instant background checks at gun shows. So what I think you have is organizations like the NRA talking out of both sides of their mouth. When watered down, well, actually, let me start from the other end. When really strong gun legislation comes out, says we are going to get rid of any semi-automatic rifle anywhere in the U.S., NRA says, nope, you can't do that. That violates people's Second Amendment rights. We're going to fight it. They fight it tooth and nail. Okay, that bill dies. A much more watered down bill comes out that says, okay, we're only going to eliminate certain kinds of ammunition with the extended magazines. We are going to say that you have to just get a background check before you get it, and even like a 2-hour waiting period. And they say, you know what? That wouldn't have stopped Columbine. They got their guns legally. You know what? That wouldn't have stopped this mass shooting. That wouldn't have stopped the Vegas shooting. So why are you even passing it? And so they oppose it because it's not strong enough. There is no bill that they would ever support, ever in any. So before we continue, what are your thoughts on either of those policies and or whether the NRA is indeed doing tactics like that?
I'm not a member of the NRA, and mostly because they are a political advocacy group. I don't think they're evil. I don't think the people in the NRA are evil. I think they have a single goal, and that's to stop gun infringement. And they don't, doesn't matter what kind of infringement it is. Their goal is to stop it, whether it seems reasonable or not. Because of course many of the stuff put out by the NRA talks about a slippery slope, and this does happen in reverse. Just what you explained about, it's not just that the NRA is going to try and block it, because they're just going to block everything, and you just need to know that. There was one thing I wanted to come back to. What was the very first thing you talked about? Shoot, I had it just on the tip of my tongue. Now I can't remember what it was. So you're 60%. 60% of people. That's true. But polling data, when you put out there and you just say, "Hey, are you in favor of stricter gun laws?"
Yeah.
You'll come back, and usually between 60 and 70% of Americans will say, "Sure." And then when you call with very specifics and you say, here's a gun control policy that we wish to pass, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one. When you go through them and actually list out what the policies are, that support drops from 60 to 70 down from 30 to 50, depending upon which proposal it is. So yeah, we have this generalized sense in America that we should have reasonable, gun laws. And I think that reasonable people would agree. I agree, therefore I must be reasonable, right?
Well, jury's out on that, but yeah, okay.
Well, I'm still a crazy gun nut because I own guns. No, there's a lot of things that have been put out there. NRA is going to oppose anything. Doesn't matter. Didn't used to be that way. Back in, I believe, the 50s, they actually proposed gun legislation and supported it. And helped get some gun legislation passed. Of course, they've recently come under fire for that because it happened in response to the Black Panthers primarily arming themselves and holding protests. And many legislatures were concerned about that and decided they were going to try and ban that, and the NRA supported them for that. So, but I don't think the NRA is inherently racist. I don't think they're evil. They have an agenda. Their agenda is to
It's
stop
a political
gun
organization
control.
with a single goal. Yeah, it's just
Yes.
it's one goal. That's
Yes.
it, and there's nothing.
Which
else
is why
but
they're
that.
so good at it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's it. They have one thing: no.
And why they're not.
And that's all they really got.
Why I would support any conclusion that they're not, for example, racist. They don't have the time. They don't have the energy. They don't care. That is outside of their purview.
Care. They don't care about anything else. They're just like gun control. No. No. So there's some things like the gun show loophole people always talk about. I dislike calling some things loopholes when they were specifically designed that way. Like they talk about tax loopholes, except the tax code was specifically written that way. It's not actually a tax code. That's simply what the tax code is. It's not a loophole. But there have been some people that have decided, and in this case, it may actually be applicable to say loophole, because there's been some people that have decided to act a little deviously, and instead of declaring themselves an FFL, they have decided they were going to sell a personal collection. And when selling personal property, you are not required to give somebody a background check to sell them your gun in most places. In my state of Washington, that is not true. Any firearms sale to anybody who is not a direct or immediate family member, that means mother, father, grandfather, son, daughter, grandson, granddaughter, brother, sister, that's it. If they're one of those to you, then you can buy them a gun, you can give them a gun. There's no background check in that whatsoever. Anybody else, if I want to sell any one of my firearms, I have to take them, the person who wants to buy my firearm, we have to go down to an FFL dealer. I have to hand my firearm to them. They hold it. They have to run they take the other person's money. They run all of the same background checks, just like they were buying a brand new weapon. And if they pass, then they hand the gun to them, the money to me, and we walk away. They charge us minus $20 or so, $20, $30. And I have seen instances that have led me to believe and almost default to the position that when somebody finally gets a gun control law passed, they're not satisfied. Now, okay, great, we got a magazine capacity restriction down to 12 rounds. Well, now we're going to push next year for it to be 8 rounds. And then for the year after that, if we manage to get it to 8 rounds, like in Massachusetts, now we're going to push for firearms that don't have a magazine at all, no detachable magazine. So, and I've seen this way too many times. It's like I'm willing to give you, in a reasonable discussion with somebody, that there's some gun control laws, some gun regulations that I believe are appropriate and should be implemented. And I hesitate in a lot of cases when talking to people to give them that, because now, great, you just gave me everything now I want magazine bans. Why? Why? What good is this going to do? Or I want magazine restrictions. Nobody needs more than 10 rounds in their firearm. Excuse me, we just spent 4 weeks now watching classic examples of why you would want more than just 8 rounds or 10 rounds in a magazine when you have 30 people that are about to mob you. People don't necessarily work alone. Well, I find it interesting that many of these people who championed many left-wing causes, that I cannot link them directly to being anti-gun and supporting specific anti-gun legislation. I can only link them to being very leftist supporters of organizations that also try to limit guns and don't want guns, that now seem to be very keen and interested on owning especially AR-15s. The CHOP, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or whatever they call it now. Well, they finally cleaned it out because they did a demonstration march to the mayor's house, and she decided, okay, these people are whack job crazy, and it's time to be done with this. Mostly because it directly affected her, I think. She was fine with it happening in Capitol Hill, not so fine with it happening at her house.
There's probably some truth to that, but it was also the shootings there. There was 5 shootings there in 2 weeks. Yes. 2 people killed. I think she was just like, look, we can't have. Sorry, playtime's over.
Oh. Well, and again, they they closed all that stuff off. They suddenly found the necessity and why some people are like, yeah, we kind of sort of need borders. Yeah, we kind of sort of need people with guns to protect those borders, because you don't want just normal people, coming across, or just anybody coming across. We want to know who's coming across. And they started arming themselves to protect, to keep other people out. And it's like, okay, I'm all for you arming yourselves and not for you murdering people. I'm not for you taking, public spaces and denying entry to people, especially if they own property there.
Yep.
There's a lot of things they did that I don't support, but I'm like, welcome to the club. Welcome to understanding why it is I support the Second Amendment. Your ability to arm yourself is to be able to stand there and actually have teeth when you look at the city and you say, this isn't right, we need things changed, and you're not just going to push us away, because you can't. And that was the entire purpose of the Second Amendment to begin with, was, so you couldn't, people are so worried about a police state. They're so worried about, how cops are the only ones armed, yet gun control is only going to give cops, the only ones, the weapons. I mean, you don't want to give somebody with a monopoly on the use of force access to the only arms available. That's a bad recipe. It's turned out horribly in the past. And that was why we have that today. I think more people are beginning to at least embrace it in actual practice, if not, come out and say, oh, now I understand.
I do want to get to Quest's super chat, but there's actually a couple of things I want to hit there, because I also want to get to brass tacks on a few of these issues. The gun show loophole, just for those who, the problem with I agree that if you are going to have guns be legal, and I understand the concept of if somebody has a gun and they're out in the middle of New Mexico, not near any government buildings, they shouldn't have to go register. And if they know each other, one of them wants to sell one of them their firearm, I completely get that. But that was the point of that exception, which was for private sales. What you have in the gun show loophole is you have businesses that sell guns professionally that are required to follow.
Agree on that.
Yeah. And so what they're doing, but just so our audience knows, I know you know this, but just so our audience understands what the gun show loophole is you then have businesses that are selling guns professionally but don't want to have to do the background checks. They claim it's a private sale, and they'll have the owner of that business there and say, well, these two guns right here are actually my business guns. The rest is my personal collection. So just look at my personal collection of 20, 30 different kinds of guns here. If you like one, I will make a personal sale with it's his business. And they just go around doing the whole business, but through this loophole. And again, it's one that the NRA says, well, it doesn't exist. I would like to point out
with this loophole is that it is not nearly as big an issue, because we're talking major felonies if they get caught doing this. And it is not super difficult to find to catch them doing this if they do it. This isn't a widespread thing. It's kind of like a gun here, a gun there.
A number of the shooting.
No, you can't sell 30 of your store's guns as a personal collection. And if somebody decides to, now question is in some jurisdictions, do they actually check? Because those are major felonies. And I don't actually know a single FFL that would risk something like that. But maybe in backwoods Alabama, I don't know.
I've seen undercover investigations from news organizations that do it, and I know that check it, and I do know that any federal agency that says they're going to investigate this gets pushed back by, once again, the NRA, who says, no, you can't go and even investigate. And that's what they did with the CDC, too, which the CDC said, seeing as guns are, by the National Institutes of Health, declared a public health crisis, and indeed we have more deaths by guns in this country than in any other, per capita, 3 times more than any other industrialized nation. And they said, you know what, let's just investigate this. We're not saying take away the guns. We're saying investigate this. And what Congress did, and solely it was the Dickey writer, solely at the behest of the NRA, they said it would be illegal. Essentially prohibited it. They didn't technically prohibit it, but they made it so it was, for all intents and purposes, prohibited. So they couldn't even study it. So, and then just to make sure. Of
course, they do study gun violence in America today, but
not
as much. I don't know if I want the CDC studying it, but I can agree with you that I like numbers, and one of the arguments that I have is specifically, I take the worst case scenarios. I try and give you the strongest position you can have, and then see if my argument still holds up. So yeah, but I mean, we covered the NRA. They're going to say no. They're going to do everything they can to stop anybody from doing anything with guns.
But my point is, it's really hard to catch anybody at most of these conventions, because it's been made crystal clear that there's not supposed to be any real enforcement of most of this stuff. And I forget which one of the mass shooters, but one of them did use the gun loophole to get his AR-14. And I mean, the number
15.
of thank you, AR-15. The number of videos that I've seen of them of undercover I mean, they catch these guys doing it, and they plaster it all over the news, and to the best of my knowledge, nothing happens to them. But what I do want to get into, actually, let's just do the super chat real quick. 5001 from Quessa. Okay. Thank you. How is it that state laws can dictate such matters of safety and security? Shouldn't that be under federal authority? U.S. seems too decentralized, in my opinion. Well, it depends on a whole bunch of it. It is awfully decentralized, but it's a patchwork of what they can and can't do. The states have some authority to do it, but people can also just go outside the states. So one argument that I've seen is Chicago put in some pretty strict gun laws in place. And then there was a mass shooting in Chicago. I'm like, wow, see, the laws didn't work. The reason the laws didn't work is because the guy went outside of Chicago to go get his gun and then came back in. And because
I do have a response to that.
Please.
Too, by the way.
Please. Okay, so yeah, let's hear it.
Go. If you want to finish it off, just remember that I have a response to
let's do your response. And what I'd actually like to do is, because I do want to get into, I want to start with the police, and I want to get into some issues where I think you and I would have more contention, because I want to stay away from where we agree as much and hit some of the contentious, because I think we do have some contention. So let's please, why don't you do yours, and I'll go back to the police. Yeah.
One of the things, yes, Chicago has got some of the strictest gun control laws in the nation as far as the city of Chicago. There isn't a gun store in the city of Chicago. They're not legal. They're very strict. Yet people love to use Chicago because, in terms of absolute numbers, there's a lot of people shot in Chicago. I think Memorial Day weekend, it was something like 100 and some people were shot over Memorial Day weekend. 4th of July was something like 50. I'm pulling these numbers out of memory just from having listened to them on the news. I did not look them up. However, I did look up the most dangerous cities as far as, or the most, shootings, and Chicago actually sits kind of in the middle. Oddly enough, St. Louis is the most dangerous per capita, has the most number of shootings per capita. So yeah, Chicago sits down in the middle. However, all of the cities in Indiana, because the general thing is well, people are leaving Chicago because Indiana's not all that far away. I mean, from Chicago to Indiana, depending on traffic, will take you 45 minutes to 9 hours. So it depends upon what time of the day you try and leave. But there is no city in all of the state of Indiana that has the same kind of gun violence issues that the city of Chicago does. Now, ostensibly, the people in Indiana don't actually have to go anywhere to buy their guns. They're getting the guns just like they can anywhere else, and we don't see the same levels of gun violence in the state of Indiana that we see in Chicago. So I don't think that the ability to go to Indiana to buy your firearms has that much to do with the gun violence problem in Chicago. Otherwise, we would have the same kinds of gun violence issues in Indiana itself. I think that there's some other issues going in there, which always brings me back to every time we talk about contentious topics, no matter what they are, is that things are far more complicated than people want to make them out to be. There are far more issues at play. There are far more things that need to be looked at than the oversimplistic views that especially the media and most of the people that I talk to look at something with.
I like to think my views are nuanced. The only way I win an argument is if I assume my opponents are all simple. So you have not been cooperating with that, but I'm going to work on it.
I'll work on it. I'll be more simple from now on.
Yeah, you better.
Okay, here's one. Here's one that we both.
I should have kept my mouth shut.
I believe I remembered you saying that if you could wave a wand, your optimal solution would be to simply remove gun ownership and gun possession from private individuals, period.
Yes, that is correct.
Private citizens not have any guns at all. And of course, there we
take it one step further, but yes.
I want everybody.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree, and I do want to get to that. And I think that's so, but I want to get to that vis-a-vis this. So I agree, and that is so that one of the big differences is I truly would like to repeal the Second Amendment. I don't think we need it. I think it should be gone. Now, and I don't think private citizens should have guns. Now, you did give an argument there, which I actually do think is a straw man, because it's not how any other state does it. It's not what anybody's proposing. But what you had said is, okay, at that point, you have with the police the only ones armed, and I don't think that's a good idea. I agree with you. I don't think that's a good idea, but I don't think you end up with that, because I think that's only if you say the reason the police are armed is because we arm our criminals. If we're gonna arm the criminals, you have to arm the police. There's no choice. I don't like the police being armed. I really don't. And I think if you talk especially to a lot of the Black Lives Matter people, they don't like them being armed either. So I wanted to pull up this graphic here. So I've got two graphics, and this is, and we're going to talk just about the police for 1 second, and then I want to segue from that into. Okay. But what I have here is a graph of. And that one may be too small, so I'll read what it says.
Yeah, but I think my picture's over the top of it too. Oh no, never mind.
No, it's on the.
I'm sorry, I'm seeing something else.
Yeah, that one didn't quite line up. I didn't have time to fix it before the. But what this is. Yeah, I can only handle the simple ones, Isandering. That's the problem. So what this is civilian deaths at the hands of police or security forces by country, and it's per capita. The worst is Venezuela and El Salvador, followed by Syria, Nicaragua, Jamaica. You get Philippines, Brazil, a few others. Not as far from the top as you would expect is the United States. It is the first industrialized country on that list. Below the United States, Iraq, Nicaragua, Kenya, Honduras, Iran, Angola, Colombia, Mali, Sudan, Rwanda, Mexico, Bangladesh, Pakistan. These are Swaziland, Argentina, Egypt. We haven't hit another industrialized nation yet in terms of civilians killed by their own police and or security forces. Now, I'd like to see that number go down. There's only one way. You have to take the guns out of the police. That's what the Brits have done. The police in England aren't armed, but they don't have to be. Now, if you take a look at the total number of deaths, we in the United States had in 2017, 1,200 Americans were shot by police officers, were killed by police officers 3 times the number that were actually killed by mass shooters. We had 700 of those were suspects in non-violent offenses or people who were stopped for traffic violations. Now, as of June 30th this year, there have been 506 people shot and killed by police officers. In the UK, 3 people have died this year in police custody, or in the attempt to bring them in police custody. 3 people. The police in the UK killed 3 people. In the US, as of this point right now, they have killed 506, and that number is low. The reason that number is low is because the police aren't actually required to give these numbers to the FBI or any federal organization because they're civilian authorities. I think they should be. These numbers are low. Why do the U.S. kill 506 people trying to arrest them or just in traffic stops when you're halfway through the year? Because the police are armed, they're trigger happy, and they're worried that the people that they're pulling over are armed. The police shouldn't have guns. I agree. The police should not have guns, and that would lower that number, so we are not at nearly the top. I mean, Iraq does better at not killing its own civilians than we do.
I would like to know, though, where some of those numbers are actually coming from, because I don't think I really trust the official government numbers coming out of someplace like Nigeria, for example. I don't trust the official government numbers coming out of someplace like Cuba, let alone someplace like Nigeria.
Well, let me ask you this:
so
would you trust Canada?
I wonder about some of those.
Would you trust Canada?
Yes, I do. Yes, I would trust Canada.
Canada's numbers are 1/3 of ours. And well, let's see, ours was, I can get ours in a second, but Canada is 20 countries down below us. Now, even if all of those countries are lying and their numbers are 3 times higher, ours is so
the
high.
The point still stands. I'm just pointing out that
Okay.
I'm wondering where some of those numbers come from. I'm not questioning that the point is still valid.
Okay. So, and then,
So yeah,
I put up that chart, and
so
then
my question to you would be,
yep.
Do you think that it is possible? Did I just say possible? Possible?
Yes, you did say
reasonable,
possible. Yes.
I'm sorry. Is it possible or reasonable to remove all of the guns from private ownership in the United States? Do you think you could do that? You think you'd take the 350 million guns that exist in the United States now and get rid of them in any meaningful way?
Yeah, okay, I'll take because those are 2 separate questions. The first is take all. No, it is not. But it's not, that can't be done anyway because there'll always be somebody who can hide it. In any meaningful way, yes, I think it is bloody fucking difficult. I think it's hard. But the reality is this country has done a lot of hard things before when we put our minds to it. And the example that I use, I know the example you're probably sick of because it's the one that everybody sticks to, is Australia, which had now we have 120 guns for every 100 people in this country. No other. I still don't understand why we need that many guns and why, but that's how many we've got.
By far, the United States has more guns than any other nation on Earth. Private guns ownership than any nation on Earth.
We are 4%. We are 4% of the world's population. We have 40% of the guns private ownership in this country, and 30% of the mass shootings. We have 4%. 4% of this planet's population.
I actually looked at
30% of the mass shootings. Yeah, 30% of the mass shootings.
My question, I do have maybe it would sound, and it's probably going to end up sounding flippant, but why aren't things worse? We have 5 times the number of privately owned firearms than the next nation on that list. And yet we don't top the lists in gun violence. We don't top the lists in homicide. We don't top the lists in suicide. We don't top any of those lists. When it comes to like industrialized nations, we do top some of those lists.
We top all of them for industrialized nations. This is both, and I have actually. So this is the suicide and gun violence lists up here, and the middle one is the U.S. And then the one on the right is gun-related deaths in high-income countries. The bottom bar, the blue, is suicide, which you can see is, if you add both of those, suicide actually makes up 2/3 of the gun deaths in this country. But if you take a look at that red bar, which is murder, that's higher than, and the next closest country is less than 1/3 of that number. But and I did cut you off, so I want to let you finish. But I will say this: the reason, this is the really insidious part. This is the part that troubles me. The reason that it's not worse is because there is truth. There is truth to the defense that the reason people aren't going around shooting everybody is because other people may be armed. That is true. That is acting as a deterrent. That's why things aren't worse. But the fact that that's a stopgap and keeping things from sliding into absolute hell, which it is. It absolutely is. And that's the problem.
I don't think that it is, though, because generally speaking, I mean, examples recently to the contrary, generally speaking, the majority of Americans abide by law and order. They like the rule of law. You know, the fact that they don't shoot somebody has nothing to do with whether or not that they may be armed or not. They do it because they like law and order. They're not going to go shoot somebody. They're generally good people.
Well, not over some basic stuff, but
when it comes to total gun deaths, I believe the total gun deaths number was, what was it, 30-something thousand? Of which
36, yep.
Yeah, of which 10,900, at least in 2018, 10,900 and some change were homicide. And out of that, you know, and I don't think that you can, I don't think it's realistic or reasonable to be able to pull away the Second Amendment, period. I don't think you'd ever be able to get that. Well, maybe you could. It would require one hell of a paradigm shift in the attitudes of Americans in order to repeal the Second Amendment.
Yes,
so I don't think that is even. I mean, and you certainly, if you're trying to come out of the gate with that, you're never going to get that to happen. Whether you think that it would be a good thing or not, that's not a realistic solution. So we're left with what they're doing now, because they can't amend the Constitution, and you're certainly not going to repeal it if you can't amend it. So we're left with people passing laws and what is reasonable.
But that's why
I mean, personally.
That's why there's the float, though. You had said, and I agree, it seems disingenuous to me, and so I get it why you say, well, first we meet and we grant, and I say, okay, let's meet halfway, we'll say, without the magazines, and as soon as you get that, they want more, and they want more, and they want more. And I'm just telling you, yeah, that's because my ultimate goal actually still would be, and I'd be willing to negotiate with what's reasonable and what can be done today. But my belief is, and
your goal, right? Your goal is no gun ownership, private gun ownership, period. And therefore, you wouldn't need police armed as well.
Correct. And that was the other comment I said I'd add. If it was said, I will say this: if you told me today you would take away all, just a magic wand, take away all the guns in private possession today, but the cost of that would be police got to keep theirs, I would say no. That I would say no to. That I would say no to that.
Yeah, because that is
a
very troubling. I mean, because some of the biggest atrocities of the 20th century were committed by people with guns against people without guns. Hundreds of millions of people were killed.
Can't now the next argument that I see coming down the pike is, well, wait a minute. Okay, so that the police shouldn't be armed with an unarmed. So what about the military? Okay, yeah, but posses comitatus. The military aren't supposed to be working inside the U.S. Now, okay, well, what if they do? We want to. Okay, but once again, we're looking at countries. Here are the numbers. This number right here. So this is the rise of gun deaths in the U.S. over the last little over 10 years. In 2017, it was actually 37,713 gun deaths. I think it was 16,000 of that was homicide. So it was the smaller portion, but it's 16,000. Now, we had this discussion before. People sometimes on the left say you get to use that whole number as if you don't, because the suicides is a different case. But you also don't get to ignore it, because in every country that has enacted gun control, this is something I would not have expected, but this is what the data shows. Those suicides go away, and there isn't an increase in suicides by other methods. Those suicides just vanish. And the thinking why is because the only people who commit suicide by gun, and it doesn't seem quite right, but this is what the data has shown so far. The people in general who commit suicide by gun, it's impulsive, it's very quick, and they would change their mind within a couple of minutes in the amount of time it would take to have used any other method. If you take away the gun, they end up, the vast majority, certainly enough that you can't statistically detect the remainder, don't actually end up trying to commit suicide. And 97% of those who use a gun end up succeeding, where the vast majority who attempt another method do not. Now, I agree, if they're going to eventually commit suicide and they want to, they can. But a lot of people, actually more than most people think, at some point do consider suicide. And what is available to them in those dark instances is huge. And the fact that we have guns available here versus other countries that don't has a tremendous impact on the suicide. It's not the same thing as the homicides, but you also don't get to eliminate them. But I see,
and here's where I get to sound like the classic right-wing heartless bastard.
Okay. Live chat. Here's what I want you to do. We discussed this before the show started. Everybody should have by now their list of 10 ways in which they're going to make fun of him, or 10 things to just make him look bad, say how horrible he. This was that moment I told you about. I want you to prepare these comments.
This is my heartless. I'm a heartless, horrible human being.
Okay, let's do it. Let's do it.
Give everything to be. Suicide. And suicide prevention and treatment of suicide. I mean, the suicidal thoughts are caused by something, and it's not gun ownership. So I want, treating suicide, taking away guns is a symptom, and yes, it will save lives. I can't deny that if you were to remove all the guns so that somebody who may be temporarily suicidal due to something going on in their mind that's not right, they don't have a quick and easy and effective way of committing suicide, so they're going to balk at like jumping off a bridge or hanging themselves, something that could potentially hurt, because it's amazing how much of a deterrent pain is to things.
Yeah.
So I can understand that, but what I come down to is their lives, and they matter to somebody. Suicide angers me because I find it one of the most selfish things somebody can do, because there are somebody, and in most cases there are people around them that very much care for them, and instead of reaching out and helping, and I understand that there's mental issues here, and this isn't as simple as my non-mentally problematic brain, or at least not mentally problematic in that way, may not be able to grasp, but I still find it, because you're hurting so many people around yourself when you do that, and you're going to be gone and out of it, and you're leaving all these people with a hell of a lot of pain. And the fact that suicide is, with the exception of, I guess, victimizing yourself, or and putting your loved ones in emotional pain. But I mean, as far as suicide doesn't deprive anybody else of their rights. It doesn't, infringe upon anybody else's rights. It doesn't victimize anybody else. When it comes to suicides, yes, it's an issue that needs to be looked at, and I understand that. And we should take that and we should put it over here, and we should look at it because it deserves its own consideration. When we're looking at what kinds of gun control for the regular law-abiding citizen, suicide has very little sway over me, simply because you're not violating other people's rights, and it should be dealt with by experts that know. I don't know mental health. I'm not an expert in mental health. The mental health experts should do that. And if they come back and say, well, the only way that we can solve, well, I don't buy for a second the argument, that more guns equals more suicides, because we don't lead the world in suicide, and when we don't, Japan does. And gun ownership is almost negligible over in Japan, and yet they still have the highest rate of suicide of the modernized world. I mean, I don't know how you would measure suicide rate in third world countries where they don't really keep its statistics, but of the places that we can generally. So saying more guns means more suicide, that's clearly not true. Now, I can agree that there are a portion of the suicides committed, like you said, that are impulsive, and that if they didn't have access to an effective, quick, and more, at least thought of pain-free way of committing suicide, then yes, the suicide rate would drop. And would it come up? I don't know. I have not studied enough about suicide. I mean, that was one argument that I did not research, again, because I don't generally argue on suicide grounds. I care about the homicides, because that is somebody using a firearm to take somebody else's rights, to victimize somebody else, to infringe upon other people's rights. And that really bothers me, because I don't. One of the reasons that I own a gun is so that somebody can't do that to me.
Well, so I think you bring up one point that I really want to make sure that I hit on, which is, I think the reality is that the suicide is a mental health issue. Emil Durkheim wrote a book. It was actually called Suicide, and it is the definitive work on suicide. And he studied cultures, and what he found was that in any culture where they focused too much on the individual or too much on the community, you saw increased rates of suicide. And he gave lots of examples, but Japan was one of his in Japan, they actually try to wipe out, in many ways, an individual's identity. It's you're tied to your business, you're tied to your school, and it's just sort of very, the individuals weren't able to express themselves a lot, and anybody who tried to express themselves just got shit hammered by the community, and so the bullying would lead to suicide, as would the fact that they couldn't express themselves. But I agree that the best solution is you have to try to fix the society and fix what's wrong with it. But the other thing is that even in a perfectly healthy society, suicidal ideation. So there's what's called active and passive suicidal ideation. Seeing people who have passive suicidal ideation that switches to active, who end up either getting help or committing suicide, the availability of something that allows them to act impulsively is often the difference between that, where if they can't do it, and I think pain is the other one. Right. The pain is actually the bigger one, and I think you're actually right about that too. Which is there are people who sit there and say, "Well, I'd kill myself, but they can't find a painless way to do it," which sounds a little. But
I have
yeah.
a very morbid Navy story. It just happened in the Navy. It doesn't have anything to do with the Navy, about suicide and pain. This really isn't the place for it. It's because it's kind of morbid it's morbid in that somebody more than likely died. And
Well,
it's a little bizarre and funny in that in the discussions that were leading up to what actually happened. Fine. We were on an outdoor mall in San Diego, and the movie theater's on the third floor. So the walkways are kind of like on the outside, and these corners you can actually look down. And over the main plaza, there's one of those stores that has like the Disney or the cartoon characters or whatever. I can't remember what the store is, but it looks over the front plaza to this outside mall, strip mall, 3-story high. We just gotten out of the movie watching, I don't know what. We were all standing at the corner looking down. It's 3 stories down to the pavement below. And I remember looking over at one of my friends like, do you think you would feel it if you jumped from here and hit the ground? That was the question. Would you feel it, or would you hit the ground and it would knock you out, or would you go unconscious or whatever, or kill you fast enough that you wouldn't feel pain? And we had like a 5-minute discussion on whether we thought we would actually feel anything when you hit the ground. We wander around, come back. We end up back at the beginning of this. Just as we walk around the corner, somebody jumped from that exact spot.
Oh my God!
And hit the ground right in front of us. And of course, it's a shocking thing. And and of course, everybody stands there and stares at him. He's not bleeding profusely from anywhere that we can see, and he just jumped from 3 stories and hit a concrete, landed flat sideways, almost face prone on his stomach on the ground. Well, of course, we call the police, and then the guard comes over and he kind of keeps everybody back, and an armed guard keeps everybody back. And my whole thing the whole time is like, why is nobody trying to do anything to help him? Nobody has touched him. And of course, I know that he's probably got a hell of a lot of internal injuries, and moving him probably is not a wise idea. But nobody's even checked to see if he's breathing. Are you alive? Is there a pulse? Nobody's done nothing. And the one guy just said, well, there's nothing we can do for him here. He's clearly not there's no external profuse bleeding that we can stop.
Yeah.
Moving him is probably going to do more damage. All we can do is sit here and stare at him until the ambulance gets here with the backboards and they can start moving him. And I did not find out if he lived or not, but it did not appear that he was breathing when they wheeled him away. And of course, much later, when we thought how bizarre this was, that we were literally talking about that and then wondering, did this guy overhear us and our discussion? Because we came to the discussion that depending upon how you landed, if you landed face first, you wouldn't feel anything. If you landed flat, who knows? Maybe you would, probably not, because it'd probably knock you out. But if you landed on your feet, it'd probably hurt like hell because you'd probably break a lot of bones and not do enough damage to knock yourself out. And then we watched this guy do a swan dive. Much later, we were like, we should have run up there and asked, did you feel anything? And at least we could have gotten an answer.
Wow. Okay.
An answer to our question.
Okay. Well, actually,
I said it was a little morbid, but
Jesus,
suicide and
you ain't kidding. I'll say this, and then I want to move on. But excuse me, we were just talking and wondered if it hurt. I do have to put that up because that was a good. But I will say Craig Ferguson. I don't know if you know who that is. He is late night talk show host. I like him. A lot of it. He reuses a lot of the jokes.
Scottish guy.
But yes, that's him. Wrote a book called Between the Bridge and the Water. And it's draws from his experience with suicidal ideation. And I actually saw an interview because of Between the Bridge and the Water. So it's about a guy who jumps off a bridge. And I think that's the concern that most people have, is not the pain. The thing is, actually, there's so much trauma done so quickly to the body that your body can't process it. It's what's called a pain gate. So you actually can't process. It doesn't matter how you land. If you jump from a 3rd-story floor, you're actually not going to feel it. But the concern I think most suicide people have when they're considering something like that is, am I going to change my mind? No, I'm not going to change my mind, and then I'm stuck with the fact. Because I would
think that if somebody was genuinely contemplating, I had a boss at a place that I worked that committed suicide with a nail gun. So my question is, he was Canadian, so he didn't have access to a gun.
Yeah.
That sounds flippant. That's 100% true. He lived in Canada.
Yeah, he was in Canada, so
I lived close enough to the border. I live close enough to the border that we can go back and forth just for lunch if you wanted to. Well, not now. It's closed down. But at the time, he was the manager it was a Canadian-owned company making saw blades, big round saw blades. And he put a nail gun against the side of his head, and he managed to get 3 nails in there before he was able. Yeah, and they came in that morning, and he was dead. But
I saw an interview with
forgot what I was going to say.
Ferguson was talking about the book, and we. Oh yeah.
Does it hurt? I think that's the reason is there's the thought that if you shoot yourself in the head, it's not going to hurt. You're not going to feel anything. And I think that's what the big draw for, because people committing suicide, I imagine, were already in quite a lot of pain, and they don't need to, or don't want to inflict physical pain on top of it. And
I think that's true. I think there was a guy who was talking about, and I forgot, I think it was actually with Ferguson, where Ferguson was talking. Yeah, it's not the fall that kills you; it's the sudden stop. There was a guy who was talking about his suicidal ideation, and he survived. He said the thing that everyone always asked him was, once he jumped off the bridge, did he change his mind? And he said, this is the way I put it. I thought, as I was on that bridge, I thought about all my problems. My wife, my kids, there's my family. My wife was leaving. She was taking the girls. She was taking all these terrible things going on in my life. I had so many problems. I just needed it to stop. Out of money. I lost my job. I didn't think I could do it. He goes, and then I jumped off the bridge. And as I jumped off the bridge, I realized I really actually only had one problem in my life, and that was that I just jumped off a bridge. I always thought that was pretty.
Well, I mean, a lot of times, I mean, it's kind of like, in the Navy when you'd have certain females that decided they didn't want to go on deployment and would go get pregnant, and I'm like, that's an awfully long solution to a fairly short-term problem, which is why I didn't really think that actually happened, but there's a lot of people. It's like, oh no, it actually really does happen.
All right, 5-dimensional.
I can't imagine that.
Or $5 from Fourth Dimensional. Oh, yes.
Yep,
let me finish this super chat. Did I miss it? Did we talk about the availability of guns? Cat's out of the bag now. You can easily make guns at the. I actually did want to chat about that in a little bit, but I also want to get back to why I think the Second Amendment canon should be repealed, because we're sort of close to that, but not quite there yet. But please, Isandering, what were you going to say?
Oh, I just happened to glance at the side chat down here, and somebody had made the comment, I'll lay my life down in order for you to carry your musket. I can't find it exactly right now, but in the terms of saying that it only covers muskets, which isn't true, because even in the time of the founding fathers, they had rapid fire prototypes that functioned. The U.S. government even ordered them. Yeah, they had a lot of ideas of what could potentially happen. Secondly, we don't apply that standard anywhere else to any of the other rights that the Bill of Rights guarantees. The founders could never have imagined the internet. Why the heck do you have any kind of free speech on the internet at all? They never could have imagined, the kinds of air flight that we have today to be able to mail things around the world the way that we do. We don't apply that standard anywhere else to any other rights. And the fact that the founders specifically knew that they couldn't foresee everything that may happen, which is why they left a process to amend the Constitution in case something became necessary to amend due to technological improvements. Well, and I don't honestly buy that somebody's going to lay their life down for me to carry my musket. Americans.
Yeah, I don't buy that either. I'm sorry. I do. Yeah, I hear that a lot. And I was just like, yeah, when it comes down to it, which gets me to, because that does get me to, because they use that same argument in Australia, and then turns out. But first of all, I do get also all the time, and this is one of the other disingenuous arguments, which is, hey, Nick, it's in the Constitution, so there's nothing you can do about it, except that the Constitution can be amended, and there's a process for it, because they knew it would have to be amended. And already, and you
Yes.
acknowledge this right out of the gate, which is already We have to make decisions about what constitutes an arm. A nuclear weapon is an arm. In my view, in the broadest interpretation of the Second Amendment, I mean, it's an arm, so you should be able to carry it. But obviously, even I've never met a member of the second NRA who said you should be able to carry nuclear weapons. The second you say, no, nuclear weapons are not covered by the Second Amendment, you are admitting de facto that it doesn't cover everything and that there are some weapons that are too powerful. The dispute now is which weapons are
which
those.
ones.
That's the only dispute. Yes. But this idea that it's a quantitative
difference is very misguided that there's so much focus placed on semi-automatic rifles, specifically the AR-15. That is horribly misguided. 2018, 403 people were killed with all rifles of all kinds. That's lever action, bolt action, pump action, and semi-automatic. All rifles only totaled 403 people, whereas 97% of all homicides are committed with handguns. And yet, I don't see people going after just banning all handguns. Well, except for Nick would like to see all of them banned, but
yes.
I mean, as a serious policy proposal, we have gotten more restrictions on handguns in a lot of states. There's a waiting period for handgun purchases where there is not for rifles. There's an age requirement of 21 years. I believe that's countrywide for handgun purchases and to purchase handgun ammunition, 18 for rifles. I mean, rifles, and mostly the reason is because rifles are far more powerful, but they're very difficult to conceal. But I mean, even the people trying to make the claim, there's been several claims. One, that these are weapons of war. No, they're not. No army, no insurgents, anywhere uses an AR-15. For war, that just doesn't happen. They use automatic weapons. So, and the other one is the number one choice for mass shooters, which it is not. The handgun still ranks number one for mass shooters. The handgun has killed more people in mass shootings than an AR-15 ever thought of.
And I have
the interesting thing about the
just so I don't know if you can see this, but we have that graphic up. The blue line, there is deaths by handguns. The green line is where the AR-15 comes into, which is actually below knives for a portion of the year. So, you may have a hard time seeing that graphic. So the blue line,
yes, and overall,
handguns.
Overall, knives and cutting instruments kill more people than AR-15s do. Hands, fists, hands and feet kill more people than AR-15s do. Baseball bats, blunt force objects kill far more people than AR-15s do. I mean, this is one of the reasons why it bugs me when we say we have such an epidemic. We have some trends that are concerning, although I will point out that in the time when violent crime rates and gun crime rates were precipitously dropping, there was the sunsetting of the so-called assault weapons ban in 1995. It sunsetted in 2005, and right about 96 we started to see the crime rate drop. At the same time that gun ownership was skyrocketing, and halfway through that drop, the AR-15 became legal. All semi-automatic rifles with detachable magazines became legal to purchase and became the number one selling rifle for the last decade. Number one, 2, 4, and 5th most popular rifle in the United States is all our AR-15s. The other one is a funky, weird gun. We don't want to talk about that one. Doesn't even work, so I don't get that one. So 4 of the 5 most popular guns in the United States for the last decade have been AR-15 clones. We call them M forgeries because they're not really AR-15s. Only Colt can manufacture a gun and call it an AR-15. It's a trademark name. It's like calling a tissue a Kleenex. It's functionally useful. Everybody knows what AR-15 is, but we don't. The original AR-15 was fully automatic. It's what became, after a few changes, that's what became the M16. So I dislike how when people start talking about, well, what can we agree on? Okay, it's like, well, there's a lot of things we can agree on. We shouldn't have nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or biological weapons. We probably shouldn't allow people to own fully functional Abrams tanks or fully functional aircraft carriers or F-16 fighters. I can see a lot of these things that would violate the original purpose behind the Second Amendment, or at least the original want of the founders to have the civilian population as well armed as the standing military in order to protect from the standing. So the standing military couldn't be used against them. But when it comes to arms, I take the military's version of what, essentially what small arms are. It's, you can carry it with you. It's a personal carry. It's not a mounted weapon. So some, and in that definition, some versions of a 50 caliber rifle, I hate to call it a rifle because most of the mounted versions of the 50 caliber are all machine guns, but let's say a semi-automatic version of that would not be legal to own because you don't carry it around with you. It's way too big. It's way too heavy. It is a mounted weapon. Yet we also have the 50 BMG sniper rifle, which is carried around. It's a bolt action. They also have semi-automatic 50 BMGs, and those are personnel weapons. So it's like, where do we draw the line? And what I think is reasonable is, again, what the military's definition of small arms is. And I don't think that automatic is as big of an issue. I mean, there's legally owned fully automatic weapons in circulation today. Not one of them has committed a mass murder since 1960 something. And that was back when they were legal for anybody to own. There was one mass murder. And I believe that it was organized crime related. Somebody took a Tommy gun and wiped a whole bunch of people out. But, they're legal today. We have lots. Well, I can't say we have lots. There are numerous pre-1986 fully automatic firearms, and they're not. I mean, other you have to pay a $200 tax stamp to have them, which is kind of dumb. But
well, I agree. There's a disproportionate concern over the weapons, and it's based on a perceived threat because of the number of people that are killed by those weapons in a single time versus. But nonetheless, in terms of if you really want to save lives, those aren't the weapons that you need to be addressing. I do agree with that, but there are also reasons for that, not the least of which is we've already restricted those guns, and when we did, the number of murders in this country did go down. Now, one of the things that I have here...
No, they did not. No, they did not. The number of murders in this country continued to rise after 1986 until a high of about 1994, 95. That's when it began to drop.
Now, the only reason I want to, because I actually did find that. However, there was what happened is, if you take a look at the actual number of deaths versus what I want to do is I want to find the AR numbers, because one of the things that happened was the population did not go up at the same rate. The numbers actually, the raw numbers stayed consistent, but the population growth was going up higher. So what you had was, even though the numbers looked like they were either going up or staying reasonably flat, they were going down because it's based on how many people you have in the population. It's per 100,000 people in the population. So as the U.S. population grew, the fact that those numbers didn't appear to go down in terms of the raw data as a percentage of the population, because it's per 100,000 people, the numbers actually were going down. And that is one of the things that the NRA actually does. If you go to the NRA website, they say, okay, here's the raw data. And you can see the numbers either went up or stayed consistent from year to year. That's true of the raw numbers, but it's not taking into account population growth. And since we talk about, and all the data that I've shown here is, and you have to do it because you can't
per 100,000, right?
Yeah, it has to be per 100.
And you may be correct on that. I can't argue with that because I don't recall whether the numbers that I was looking at were set in per 100,000 or not. I will have to look at that.
The NRA uses per 100,000 except on that data set, where they say, look, here's the actual numbers, and they don't use the per 100,000, where the data looks favorable to them, unless you say, hey, wait a minute, because there was a huge population growth at that time as well, too.
I mean, I try not to use the numbers put out by the NRA. I try to use the numbers directly from, like, the FBI crime statistics. And I mean, because the NRA is a political organization, and they're pushing an agenda. So
I like to use them just because I like to know what other people are, where they're getting, which is why,
although
again, I said when they say
I
there's
did use
no
so many
loophole,
numbers
there is.
from like Progress of America, the Violence Prevention Association of America. I have used a lot of anti-gun sites for their numbers that they put out. So on your graph here, I can see in blue is us, red is Australia. I have fundamental issues with comparing Australia and the United States.
I'm sure you do. So let me talk about where I'm going. I'm sure you have some idea, but just so our audience can catch up. Okay. So in Australia, they were averaging one mass shooting being defined as 4 or more people shot in the same incident. They were having one mass shooting every year or two. They had, I think it was they had 13 mass shootings in, I want to say, 16 years. Before an incident called Port Arthur, which happened in 1998. Now, in 1998, after the Port Arthur shooting, that was so bad, they said, we are going to enact strict gun control. And they did. They went all out.
Yeah. And when they did that, they went door to door to collect the guns as well. There was a mandatory buyback.
Yes, they paid you for it. It was a mandatory buyback. It was, and they made it extraordinarily illegal. And by the way, Singapore has, of course, no problem with guns. But if you use a gun in a crime in Singapore, they execute you. So it obviously can be done. I don't think we should. I'm not saying we should go that far. But when people say it can't be done, it can be done. It is done. The question is, can we done it in a way that's consistent with us? I don't think we should be doing that. But it works, and if you take a look at Singapore's numbers, they've kept the guns off the street. Now, they didn't have as many guns as we did. That is a significant difference. But at the point in which this started, they were actually not that far behind us. We now do have, again, 4% of the population, 30% of the mass shootings, and 40% of all the guns. But nonetheless, in 1996, I think I said 1998, but I think it was actually 1996, they enacted massive gun control legislation. The key arguments against this was A, you'll never get all the guns, so now only the bad guys are going to have the guns. B, you can't stop all the murders, so now all that you're doing, it's going to be completely ineffective. It's not going to work. All the arguments that are used now, every single one was used in 1996 against the National Firearms Agreement in Australia. This is a chart of what happened in terms of just homicides there in general. They went down. Now, some people found other ways that homicides by other means did go up some, but the ability to do these kinds of, and they went from averaging, actually I think it was an average of about 1.5, no, 1.8, 1.8 mass, not 1.8, sorry, 0.8 mass shootings every year. So a mass shooting every year or every other year. They went from that in an 18-year period to having 0 mass shootings, none, not one, in 20 years, not one. And there are plenty of people who say, well, okay, but they still had, yes, they did. Again, we can't, that's making perfection the enemy of progress.
It's a real shame that they broke that record, too.
Well, yes, they broke that record when they started letting people have guns again. And as the gun, if you take a look at where gun ownership is,
but they don't allow an AR-15, nor do they allow externally loaded magazines, and they weren't completely successful. I mean, they did get a lot of the firearms, but they were not successful. They estimated, I believe, the last time I read the article, and forgive me, this came from a Kiwi, not an Australian, but she lives close enough. I think that she would probably know what she's talking about.
Knowledge by proximity.
At least in the articles. At least in the articles, they're close enough.
Yeah.
Because New Zealand follows a lot of the same kinds of laws that Australia does. I mean, they're almost.
They do now.
Almost. Yes, they do now. That's what I mean. But they were finding several caches of semi-automatic firearms from before that weren't turned in, which we've already stated that there would be a whole lot of people that would just bury their guns, me included. I'd probably be one of those felons that just buried his guns in the backyard, mostly because I think that law and order and civilization is a fairly thin veneer, and it doesn't take a lot to strip it away. And
there is truth to that.
And I'm not a gun nut that wants every single. I'm not a gun collector, I should say. I own specific guns for specific purposes, and I bought those guns for those specific purposes, and those purposes haven't changed. Nothing that we've done yet has changed any of those purposes that I own them for. And I don't have any plans on getting any more guns other than maybe some spare parts, but ammunition, sure. But the one thing that I have an issue with is, comparing Australia and the United States, because they're almost nothing alike. Australia has nowhere near the diversity that we do. Their problems that they have are far different. They don't have the same population density. They've got a huge section of their country that's practically not even occupied, generally called the outback. But...
Well, okay, but I hear that argument a lot too, and it makes it sound like they're from another planet. And my counter to that is
No,
this.
they're not. And I'm not saying, and I don't want to suggest that gun control policies from other countries can't be evaluated and say, hey, did this have an effect? But you have to be careful when you start running. This isn't quite so true with Australia. I mean, Australia is in a fairly unique position in that they have far more control over their borders because they're surrounded by water, and the only way to get to them is by boat or by plane, and it's a lot easier to control the goods that are coming into the country, though they are having some problems with Malaysians
here.
Coming in.
We're not going to have guns coming in from Canada. In fact, the last mass shooting in Canada, their guns came in from here. The only place we'd have to worry about really then is Mexico. And whether or not they bring in guns depends on a number of things.
So you want to build the wall, right?
Well, I want to make sure that we know who and what's coming in. And at a minimum, that's the argument that we can't control our borders in the same way Australia can. There's a lot of truth to it. Well, there's some truth to it, because the reality is that's the same thing that basically saved us in World War II. In World War II, we were essentially an island for the purposes of World War II, so we didn't actually have any direct damage done to the United States because it was too hard to get to us. The Germans actually tried. The Japanese kind of tried too, and neither got very far because there's an entire ocean to get to, other than Pearl Harbor. That's about right. So, anyone smuggling in guns is going to have it.
Ostensibly Canada and Mexico are both our allies, and they both also know that if the U.S. falls, they're going to fall right behind us. So, I mean, it's.
And I'm going to go
I'm
with.
Just pointing out that it's a lot more difficult, because when you look at these graphs, I mean, both of them have dropped.
Yep.
I mean, of course, ours it's flatlined a little bit over the last 10-ish years. The numbers of mass shootings, thankfully, have dropped. However, there's certainly some things that I'm concerned about, and my question is how effective would trying to ban all of these weapons be? I mean, if you ban my AR-15s, I own an AR-15.
Yep.
If you succeed in banning that, how effective is that going to be? I mean, because now you've taken away one of my primary home defensive weapons to defend myself. And on the one hand, I've specifically moved to a place where I'm not likely to need, a firearm to hopefully. I mean, we had a murder committed right next door. So, and we've had the cops fly with the helicopter over our house twice looking for murderers. So maybe I'm not
speaking, you're 5 times more likely. You're 5 times more likely to use that gun to shoot a family member in Detroit, just like I collect these clippings. The clippings that I collect are when I see in the paper that a son came home late. His father thought he's a high school, he was on a date, he didn't tell anyone, he's coming home late, his father already thought he was asleep. So when his father heard him coming in through the door, he thought, oh my God, this is a criminal. He goes and he shoots and kills his own son because he thinks he's breaking into the house. That shit happens all the fucking time, or they're cleaning a gun, and poof, it goes off. And you are 5 times more likely, and everyone tells me, well, I'm not the one who's 5 times more likely because I'm responsible. But the other 4 out of 5 all said they were responsible too. You're 5 times more likely to kill someone you know, love, and care about, a member of your family, than an intruder.
It's a problem of math that 70% of the drivers polled say that they're better than average drivers.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, obviously, somebody isn't being, and I hate to say that it's not responsible because, accidents do happen.
Yes.
And accidental shootings is actually pretty damn low on the list of accidents that kill people.
And in terms of gun deaths, it's 2%.
I guess you could make the argument against that, saying, hey, well, if we banned guns, it wouldn't be, that number would be 0 instead of just 2. I think it's the second lowest. I think burning to death is lower.
Okay, so let's actually just quickly do that, because that is an interesting one. If you want to talk about what's going to kill you, I like those numbers, because here's the interesting thing, and I made this argument after 9/11. We freaked out after 9/11, created the single largest bureaucracy in world history, not U.S. history, world history.
World history, yeah.
We did it to fight Al-Qaeda because they were suddenly a threat. No, they've been trying to hit us for 20 years. That's how long it took. And they were going to succeed at some point. You can stick Ray Charles in front of a dartboard, give him 1,000 darts. Eventually, he'll get the bullseye. It doesn't mean he can see. Now, when you take all the data that we've collected over the U.S. Being the victims of terrorist attacks, since 9/11, we've lost an average of 17 Americans a year to a terrorist attack since 9/11. If you include a 9/11 and go all the way back to when Al-Qaeda first declared their fatwa, where it was a holy mission that you had to murder Americans, when they first declared that, if you go back that far, we have lost, on average, 78 Americans every year to terrorism. This includes on 9/11, 78 to terrorism. Now, you're far more likely to die of heart disease, cancer, any kind of injury, car accident, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, drugs, all of these. Your chances of actually dying in a terrorist attack, I think, are 1 in several million. Your chances of dying, you are, I think, 16 times more likely to die in a regional asteroid strike right now than you are of a terrorist attack. So, but in a mass shooting, or any kind of assault by gun, and then let me find the accidental gun deaths. Accidental gun deaths are below, one below
I would
police
pick them up,
or law
but they're on
enforcement.
my camera.
So, is there? Okay, so let's see. Heat waves, sharp objects, electricity, those are all below accidental gunshots. So you're more likely to get shot with a gun accidentally than die from electrocution. But the numbers are still low. However, for children under the age of 16, gun deaths are the second largest cause of death. They represent, I think it was 35% of deaths. 15% of the deaths. 20% of all deaths are car accidents for children. Guns are the second highest cause of death for kids under 16. That's a lot. And so one of the things one of the things I say, so here's the thing. So when we were talking about Australia, okay, fine. Australia actually has a lot more in common with us than we like to think. It was a former British colony, taming a wild.
I don't want people to think that I'm saying they're totally different. I'm just. Okay.
But I know you're not. I'm arguing both to you and to a larger audience at some, because we have people here who are watching. But the argument that I will often make when people do say that, okay. And I think you're not saying you can't compare. You just said that there are objections to the comparison. And I think it's fair to have some objections to those comparisons. But what I end up saying is there are 38 industrialized nations. 37 of them have passed gun reform. And in every single one, the number of deaths by gun went down. And it went down precipitously. According to the New England Journal of Medicine, you would have, if you did just the background checks, and did them properly on every single sale, including the private sales, if you did it on all of those, you would see a 57% reduction in homicide deaths in the U.S. just by doing that. So now the retort.
Now we're starting to tread into areas where you and I already agreed.
Yeah. But that's sort of my. Yes, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, my point is,
I'm not saying that we can't have. Yeah, there's that slight bit of delay, and I'm like, no, you go ahead. Oh no, we talk over each other. So, I'm just going to keep going. I'm not saying that that there aren't reasonable gun control laws. I mean, I came right out at the beginning and said that we should have, amended the Constitution to begin with. I very much dislike the way that the gun control laws are being brought about now, because now they're just, let's pass what we can and see what makes it through the courts, essentially.
Yep.
And that completely undermines, the fundamental Constitution. I mean, that's one fundamental liberty that we have, is the right to keep and bear arms, and a fundamental right of self-defense in this country. And one of the best ways to enact that self-defense is with a firearm. There clearly should be limits on some of the arms that are available today, and we should stand up and say, yes, we need to limit these things, and these are the ways in which they need to be limited. And I just think that calling it an epidemic, when it falls as the 14th, tied for 13th and 14th, homicide entirely, not just gun homicide, but homicide entirely, is tied 13th and 14th on the number of ways that you're going to die. This is not an epidemic. I mean, it's tragic that people die, and I have no problems with people advocating for solutions. I have no problems with looking towards other countries and other policies that have been implemented to see if they may be applicable to our country. But I have objections when comparisons are made between different countries, because there are considerable differences, especially in the amount of diversity that we have, not only in just people, but in culture and in terrain and in identity. The Southerners have their identity. You have the Intermountain West people that have their identity. You have the ranchers and people of Montana, Wyoming, Montana. You have a lot of people that have a kind of a regional identity. You have the Appalachian. We have a huge diversity contained within our borders, and we have to look very carefully when we're trying to compare what happens in the United States versus what happens in other countries, because I have to make sure that you're not just trying to say, well, hey, it worked in Denmark, therefore it's got to work here, except that Denmark is 98% homogenous. They have a central culture to them. That's not the case in the United States. So any kinds of policies that are trying to play off of that, we're all together in this, isn't going to work in the United States, because clearly after the last month, we should know that we aren't all in this together.
Well, and I'm going to use what is actually perhaps, yes, please.
Oh, this is kind of another argument which we perform risk analysis on most of the other dangerous things that we do. One of the most dangerous activities that anybody in the United States does on a daily basis is drive a car. There's thousands upon thousands of people killed and gravely injured every year just from car accidents. And yet we don't ban cars, nor do we speed limit cars. The fastest speed limit in this country on a public road is 85 miles per hour. It's a toll road in Texas. Amazingly enough, they'll allow me to drive it with my truck if I want to pay the toll. But I don't particularly want to do 85 in my truck, because it gets 2 miles per gallon fuel mileage, and that's expensive. So we do risk analysis on things that we wish to have. Cars is a very good example. It's the one I like to use. I had this written down. Unfortunately, with the way that Skype runs, I can't close out the system here to actually give up all of the little notes and the statistics that I had specifically for this. Just the way that worked out, I should have thought ahead and actually had them on my tablet so I could look at them while I was talking to you. So I may get the numbers slightly wrong on this, but when you look at the number of, for example, defensive gun use is one of the things that people love to talk about with their owning firearms, and one of the reasons I own firearms is for self-defense. There are a lot of numbers touted for how many defensive uses of firearms there are in a year. If you go off of some of the polling data where you're just polling people, they say somewhere in the neighborhood of 100-ish thousand defensive gun uses in a year. And I don't like polling data, because you're just asking somebody, hey, have you ever done it? And you don't have any details. You don't have any, there's nothing else there other than they just say, hey, yeah, I had to use my gun to protect myself. Side note, my wife had to use her firearm to defend herself against a violent person in her own home until police were able to get there and get her out of the way. And it took, I think, 15-ish minutes for police to arrive at our house. Sheriffs, no, not police. We live out in the country. It takes a while. It's like I carry a gun because a police officer is too heavy. If I had access to police all the time, I wouldn't feel the need to own so many firearms. Well, I only own 5.
Only own 5.
So
okay,
yeah, and I was
this
very,
is the guy you're talking
yes,
to.
I
But
own,
okay,
I own
okay.
5 firearms.
No, it was the use of the word only that got me. I was it's just because of the guy you're talking to. You're like, I only own 5. Oh, you and I are practically simpatico on this, dude. What?
So yeah, it was. Anyway, I was very happy that she had it, but I dislike polling data because it's not very reliable, and it doesn't give us very much. So, and I also would like to give you the best numbers possible.
Right.
So there was actually a study done by the Violence Prevention Center, very left-leaning organization that is very much in favor of a lot of very strict gun controls, including banning the AR-15 outright. And they performed an actual study using the FBI crime statistics, the actual crime data that's been, so there's reports filed, they know what happened. And they showed that there was an average of about 67,000 defensive gun uses in the country during that 5-year period. And when you look at the number of gun homicides at being roughly 10, although in 2018 and 17 and 18, there was a slight uptick to almost 11,000 gun homicides. I mean, we're talking 6 times the number of people are using their guns to defend themselves than people are using guns to murder someone. Is that...
I'd like to see those statistics.
Is that not worth the risk?
Well, there's a couple of things. So first of all, there are other ways to defend yourself. I would be curious as to those statistics. I've seen some statistics similar to that. They weren't that rosy in terms of the gun ownership scenario. But the interesting thing is, A, could they have used another weapon? B, if they weren't afraid that the intruder would have a gun, could they have used another weapon? C, in many cases you end up with, because it's not just those homicides, but because somebody had once made the point that I found interesting, which was in order for a gun to be used defensively, it has to be able to be such that you can reach it reasonably quickly. But if that's the case, if it's got a gun lock on it, and yes, it's in your nightstand, but you keep your keys on the other side of and somebody's breaking into it's not going to work. So you end up increasing the chances of some kind of accident happening. But the other reason that I think that this is, it's interesting because when we start talking about rights, there is the Second Amendment right to a gun, but there is also my First Amendment right to life. And you had mentioned earlier, and I don't know if you can still hear me. I'm going to continue as if you can. Hopefully, I'm not doing it. I
can.
Oh, perfect. So there is the First Amendment right to life, and the reality is that when I get into a car, even though I'm aware that 40,000 people die a year on our highways, that is a choice I'm making. And I also have control over it. I have some control over it. I can't control the other drivers. That's true. But I know that when I go on, and I can pick the kind of car I've got. I know the safety features of the car. And these are all ones where I have a choice. If somebody else gets a gun and they don't keep track of that gun, and it goes into the hands of somebody who uses it in a mass shooting, and one of my children has had that shooting, I didn't have a choice there. That was a risk where somebody else gets to have the benefit of having that gun, and the one who's taking the risk has no...
But I would also like to point out that you have that exact same issue with the cars. Somebody else bought that car, lent it to his drunk friend, who then crashed into your wife and kids and killed them. You didn't have any choice in that either.
That's true, but that was, unless he's crashing into my house, that was a risk that and assume getting into the car. You're aware that other people are in that car and everybody else is sharing and commiserating in that risk. Unless I do buy a gun, I'm not. So that puts me in the position of, if you say, driving is too, and I know people who do this, people who say, have you seen those stats on driving? I will never get in a car. I will never drive. And they just take public transportation the whole time. I think they're fucking insane. But that's the choice they've made. But I can't say, I want to live in a country where there are no guns and stay in my birth country, in the country that I love and that I want to stay. I can't do that. And I can't say I want to stay in a country that, because now I'd feel that objection, that's one of many objections I have. That objection could be placated by having much stricter control, like the licensing and background checks and so on and so on, which I think you and I come closer to agreement on. So that's actually a reasonable one that can be solved without getting rid of the Second Amendment. But what gets me is when people sit there and say, I have a Second Amendment right to my gun. That's true. I have a Second Amendment right to my life, and the
First Amendment right.
Oh, Jesus. Yep, thank you. First Amendment right to my life. And
sorry, I almost didn't correct it because I'm sure everybody knew what you meant, yes.
Yeah, yep. And then actually, I do have some super chats, and I'll let you because I know you're getting the data. But then the other one was, the guns used in defensive, I would like to see genuine numbers in that, but I'd also like to see how those numbers break, how they get those numbers, because I have the same concerns that I think you had with that, and a couple of others. I know you're shocked. So let me do the super chats. $2 super chat.
No, you don't say. Okay, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to take your numbers. I'm sure they're right. Okay.
Yeah.
Super chat.
You're going to take all my numbers, and I'm going to question some of your. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I have to, full disclosure. I'm sorry. There's some weirdness and crap going on here, and I'm kind of moving around, which is why I shut my camera off.
Take your time.
You don't need to see my fat butt crack or anything if I move wrong.
I appreciate that. My patrons and the like financial disclosure and being monetized greatly appreciates that. So thank you. In terms of not seeing your butt crack, so I appreciate you turning the camera off. Were you going to say full disclosure? Then I do have to read these super chats, but give me your full disclosure.
I did not have enough time to go through all the entire study that they did. The reason that I was more willing to accept it without doing a lot of, looking at all of the numbers is because it's from a position that is against my own.
Yes, and you're right. You can't just take that at face value, but that is when I'm arguing. That's why I know the NRA stats. And I start, and then I also try to figure out where they get their data from. But yeah, I agree. So let's see, 5,000.
Which is why I don't know them, because I try to avoid the NRA.
Yeah, I wish I had that luxury. 5,001 from Quessa. The 61st Amendment makes Arnold Schwarzenegger president. The 62nd Amendment makes him president for life. I actually, to tell you the truth, the one thing I did, Bill Maher did a great piece on that where he basically said, it was in I think the 80s, the two people that each party wanted to run, they couldn't run. The ones that would just clinch the nomination. Bill Clinton, Dems wanted him for a third term. They absolutely wanted him for a third term, but they couldn't. He was blocked because of the term limit. But the Republicans really wanted to run Arnold Schwarzenegger. They really won. He was doing great as a governor. Everybody loved him, and I think he was governor at that point. No, maybe not. But they really wanted. They wanted, and they couldn't run him because he wasn't born in this country, which is a really kind of a stupid. I understand why at the time they needed it. We've discussed that on our thing on civics, but so it's just like, how is it that the two most popular candidates on each side you can't run? So, that's a little off from what you. But I found that interesting. So that was Quessa, $2 from Jake 4D. Do you have the overall homicide trends in Australia? I thought I did. I'm going to double check and see if I can find them. Because I think that's interesting. That one of the reasons I did have those was because I actually had the overall trends and suicide trends. Because again, what's interesting is when you remove guns from the picture, the suicide rates by other means don't go up any noticeable amount. It's just those suicides vanish, and the suicide rates in the country do drop. They don't go away, and other countries have suicides for other reasons. But that is certainly was. So let me see if I've got those. I couldn't find them. And then Jake 4D, $2 super chat. 37 out of 38 industrialized nations have recommended sugar-free gum. And thank you for being smart. Some of us here are trying to have a serious discussion. I mean, now it's not to say that I'm taking Isandering seriously, but it's like he's
don't take me seriously at all.
And then
I hope. Hey, yeah. I'm your dumb top drugger. Oh, you still have another one to do, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I got one more. $2 super check from Jake 4D. Rights aren't the issue. The moral path forward is. I think that's a good point. And I hope, by the way, I've known Isandering for some time, and I haven't had a conversation with him that I did not enjoy, and I'm enjoying this one. This one, where this isn't even heated, but we're getting a little more heated, I think, than usual. We're having a good back and forth, and I'm enjoying it immensely. But he knows what he's talking about. I think we can all agree on that. And actually, I don't find any of his positions unreasonable. I am probably the more extremist in this conversation, but at a minimum, he knows what he's talking about. So I hope you guys are enjoying it. I'm enjoying it. I'd like to try to wrap it up in about a half hour. It will be a bit of a longer show, but I think it's worth it. And but I certainly appreciate his time. If you appreciate his time too, guys, drop in a hi to him on the chat, or tell him that you appreciate his coming here, because I'm thoroughly enjoying this. But yes, Isandering, please continue.
Oh, as I've said multiple times, like the discussion I had with Arn Ra. It's like I don't agree with Arn Ra politically on just about anything. I think that we agree a lot on what some of the problems are, but what those solutions should be, I don't think we agree very much on. And yet I don't think that the other stuff that he does, he's one of my favorite YouTubers. I don't think the other stuff that he does has less merit because I disagree with him on something. I don't think that you're any less, I don't think you're any less valuable because you want to get rid of all guns. And you make a compelling point about, if we could get rid of all guns. I don't think we can. And so I think that position is untenable to begin with. But, I can't, there are some things that are extremely difficult to argue. If you could wave your magic wand and get rid of guns, I would have a very difficult time, saying, well, yeah, but what you're saying is just my guns, So my
let me just
coming from,
please.
You're not on. It's not a tenable position. So now what do we do?
If I can frame a little bit of, I think where we actually have much more agreement than, so I think I really would grant. Let's do the magic genie, and there are people who hate this, but I think it's a very worthwhile exercise, because it does show you what people are thinking and what their motivations are. If that magic genie came up and said, okay, you could get rid of all guns in the U.S. Except for, of course, the military. So we're just talking civilians, we're talking police, we're talking, if he could do that, I would say absolutely yes. And it sounds like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I'll finish my little rant here, and then you can clarify if I'm wrong. But it sounds like you'd actually say you'd at least have a hard time seeing why the answer to that would be no, if it was just get rid of guns across the board, magic genie. Now, I will grant at a minimum that oh, okay, so perfect. So I think that's a good. So I think we have that in agreement. I think that's reasonable positions. I would also grant that if that magic genie said, I will do it only for the civilians. Now, even if he said I'd do it only for the civilians, I'd probably agree. But if the genie's, because I would assume, and maybe this is a little wish thinking on my part, I would assume that we'd all say, okay, now the cops don't need it because, that's what they did in the UK. That's what they've done in other countries. They have disarmed the police. But if the genie actually said, I will bar the disarming of police. So I will disarm all the citizens, but the police will keep their guns, period. Nobody's going to do any legislation getting rid of it. We're going to keep the guns in the hands of the police, but the citizens will all be disarmed. I would say no to that. I would say no. So I hope, and I would assume you think that's a reasonable position, because that's certainly cool. So
I think that's a reasonable position. The one concern that I have about the first one saying let's disarm police and disarm civilians and take those guns out of circulation, they're no longer there. Nobody's got them buried in their backyard to pop up again later and become a problem, so that now only criminals are armed. The only issue that I would have, the only concern I would have that makes me hesitate to agree with you fully, let's go that route if we could, is governments can still turn tyrannical and the people have no recourse to stop them, because the government still has the use of the military. And I'll know a lot of people, I've seen a lot of people talk about, joke and make fun of the people who say, oh yeah, you're going to sit out there in your hick town with your AR-15 and you're going to take on the military. Have you ever heard of a drone? And it's like, yeah, I've heard of a drone. And my point still stands, because, and we've seen this firsthand in our own country with Ruby Ridge and Waco and a few other, the Ted Bundy issue, that in order for the military, the government, to use the military against its own population, and the own population has semi-automatic rifles to defend themselves with, whereas the Army has, the heavy infantry units and nuclear weapons. is that, one, I'm not entirely convinced that the military, having been a member of the military, I'm not entirely convinced that a good majority of the military would agree to attack its own citizens with the level of force required to overcome those hick-ass hillbillies with their deer rifles in the forest. Second, we've seen very clearly that asymmetrical warfare is not only plausible, but is very easy to do. You take the United States military has been fighting for how long in Afghanistan? With a bunch of people that have some AK-47s and goats. And they're able to inflict quite a lot of heartache. They may not be able to win the war outright, but the only reason we can't win that war outright is because we're not willing to use the level of force and accept the kinds of civilian casualties that would be required in order to actually win that war. And the same holds true in the United States. One, I don't think the military would actually do that to its own people. And two, the citizens as a general would absolutely revolt against the government if they ordered the military to use that level of force against its own citizens. So it's still a very valid point. Having an armed citizenship will keep the government from becoming entirely tyrannical, though there's plenty of people out there that believe that it's become tyrannical already, and I would agree that it has overstepped its power and overstepped its bounds and grabbed a lot of power that it was never intended to have, and for the ill of the country as a whole. But I'm not going to say that they're subjugating the population right now and mass murdering millions of people. That is like has happened in several other countries around the world.
Yep.
So that's the only hesitation I have on that. Let's just do away with civilian ownership of guns. And I do believe that even if that were to happen, though, the total number of deaths, I would think, would still go down. If I'm being completely honest, when you added everything up and said, okay, well, we don't have any of the homicides, we don't have any of the gun-specific suicides anymore, and you add that up over the next 50 years that it takes the government to become, tyrannical and subjugate the people, and some sort of revolt happens, you probably would still end up in the wash with fewer people dying.
So let me, because you mentioned a lot there, and I think some of those are spectacular points. But yes, I would also reach that same conclusion. Now, I used to be one of those that made fun of you're going to hold off the entire military with your. I used to be one of those guys, and I was talking with Ansgar actually right after that first debate too, because it was during that first debate, but then it was afterwards, and I don't know if you had been speaking with him, but I heard a similar argument from you, and I was just like, you're abso-fucking-lutely right. The reality is, wars are won, wars are lost, but there are many things that go on the scales for winning that war. And the reality is, if you're just going to talk about a bunch of people who are running some form of asymmetrical warfare, if the other country, if the United States is 100% dedicated to winning, they're going to win. You're going to get wiped out. The problem is there's no set of circumstances. That 100% is always an ideal. And it's usually, you can't even get up to 50%. Now, when you take a look at what happened in Vietnam, we were absolutely the superior militarily. We did lose, and it really pisses me off when people sit there and say, we didn't lose Vietnam, we left. Well, that's losing. And the reason that's losing was our goal was to destroy them. Their goal wasn't to destroy us. Their goal was to get us to leave. By the time the war ended, they had accomplished all of their goals. We had accomplished none of ours. So, and then we killed them 10 to 1. For every person we lost. But the reality is we didn't have the stomach for it. And the reality is the Americans were sitting here going, why are we sending our kids to die over on there? And they were willing to take those losses, and they were willing to do that. They had a much stronger will than we did for that war. Afghanistan, the asymmetrical warfare, they've beaten the Russians. They beat the fucking Soviet Union. They have been beating our asses for most of we've had the upper hand a few times and then we lose it. The rebellion against Assad, that's losing. It's losing in part because he's got help from the Russians. But even if it wasn't, this isn't to say asymmetrical warfare can always win. It's going to lose sometimes too. But it has a higher degree of efficacy in a number of situations, including and especially where the morale of the other side is an issue. And if you've got the U.S. military that has been ordered to attack U.S. civilians, morale becomes a huge issue. I find it very hard to believe that there are very many members of the military who would continue such an attack for any length of time. They might briefly, if the president just came up and said, I want you to take Cleveland at all costs, today, right now, obviously it still wouldn't happen. The military would just say, okay, Trump, go fuck yourself. But nonetheless, if he was somehow able to really kind of get in something like that, they might start. But once the shooting started and they see dead civilians, they're going to sit there and say, these are the people we're supposed to be protecting, and they're not going to be able to stomach it. So really, the goal of any defensive militia wouldn't be to win. It would be to stall as long as possible. And that's what happened in Vietnam. That's what's happening in Afghanistan. And it works. It doesn't always work. It loses sometimes too. But the notion that you can make fun of, so I can't do that anymore. And I really would like to. I'm going to have to find other things to make fun of you for, because that's no longer on the table. It really kind of sucks. I have to kind of respect that position now. I'm really pissed about it.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that from the after show, because you guys had specifically brought that up, and you had a kind of about, I think you kind of had that flippant, have you heard of drones? And,
yeah, I think that was me. You said that. I was like, I think I was noticing. Dude, they got those drones that shoot around corners now. What the fuck you can do?
Yeah.
And then you're Nick, have you heard of history?
It's just, and that's genuinely, that was the intent behind the Second Amendment when they drafted it. They wanted the civilians to be armed equal to the standing army, so that the government couldn't subjugate. And at the time, it was mostly so that the government couldn't subjugate the states. I mean, you got to realize that when the United States was formed, states' rights were tantamount. I mean, there's a reason we call them states, because they were considered to be their own little countries, and that we needed to come together to protect ourselves. And the many states were very afraid of a tyrannical government, which is why we got the Articles of Confederation. I mean, we just fought a war against a government that had become semi-tyrannical, or at least unreasonably burdensome.
Yep.
And so we had just freed ourselves from that, and they've spent a lot of time and a lot of conversations amongst themselves on, how do we stop the government from becoming tyrannical? And if we can't, which I believe most of them came to the conclusion that it would ultimately not be possible to stop a government from becoming tyrannical, so that if it did, how would we provide for the citizens to be able to overthrow said illegitimate or tyrannical government and reinstate another government? And that was the biggest driving factor behind, it wasn't hunting, it wasn't even personal self-defense, it was defense of your state, so that your state could remain a sovereign state, and that the United States couldn't subjugate you. And that still holds true today.
Yep.
A lot of things have changed, but there's been a lot of trips through the 20th century where we've seen, again, millions of people killed by their own governments.
Germany.
And it's still that is still the one concern that isn't addressed by personal or private ownership of guns being gone, including the police. Because now you're just disarming the states and making the states even more susceptible to the government, because the federal government won't get rid of any of their guns. They have the military.
Yep.
Well, they're going to keep their FBI. Their FBI is going to remain armed, because that's not considered a police force.
Yep.
So those are all issues that are all fundamentally there. And I guess if I could have my genie pop up and say, what exactly would you like to see happen? Mine would. Well, one would be that we actually, people cared about each other more, because without that, we're always going to have murder. We're going to have crimes against other people. We're going to have people taking advantage of other people. We're going to have a huge number of problems. We may eliminate one sector of problems with gun if you got rid of all of the guns, period. That portion may go away, and I'm not saying that that's not an insignificant number. It's especially not insignificant if you're either the victim of or a close family member or friend of a victim of gun violence. I mean, that's certainly a very important thing to you, and it's not insignificant to you. But But at some point, we have to stand back and look. I hate to say the greater good, because I believe in individuals, and that the individuals is what make up the greater good. So if you have something that is supposedly for the greater good but violates individuals' sovereignty, individual rights, individual humanity, then I don't see what greater good you're trying to pursue here. I mean, two wrongs don't make a right. So, but I would want people to be more responsible, care more for each other, and that we actually had a very robust private gun ownership that included training in both use and responsibility. That is one thing that I think is lacking. I don't know how you could institute something like that without violating the Second Amendment or your fundamental right to own a firearm that we currently have in the country. Because we don't put those kinds of limits on anything else. Trust me, I wish we could. I really wish we could put some limitations on freedom of speech so that you at least know what the hell you're talking about before you open your blab and spew it all over the internet. Because there's some pretty hateful stuff out there that's said, and people cheered on because they think, oh, this is great, and it's like, no, I don't think you quite understand. God, I look so bizarre with these lights on.
We're gonna have to get wrapping this up reasonably soon, but yeah, please finish up, and then I will.
Oh yeah,
I wanted to ask you your genie question, and I forgot. What?
Oh yeah, so that's what I would ask of our genie, is that that gun ownership is a normalized thing, that people feel responsible enough to get properly trained, both in the use of their firearm, when to use it, when not to use it, and the responsibility aspect of it. You mentioned that you're 5 times more likely to be injured by your own gun than you are to shoot an intruder or whatever it is. And that comes from negligence. And sometimes it's a careless negligence. I mean, we're all negligent at some point about something. That's generally how accidents on the highways happen. Somebody was negligent in their driving at some point, and we all do it at some point. So you can't be that focused for that long on just one thing. So accidents do happen, but a lot of those accidents, especially with the 16 and under crowd, would go way down if we could get people a lot more focused on gun safety, having the proper training, having the proper respect for the item that they're going to have custody of.
All right, so let me do this. I don't think I'm going to contribute anything new. I'm just going to sort of put a pin in it, and then if there's any sort of final stuff you want to say, and then we can head out of here. But what I think, one of the things that you had said, and I do think so. The idea of defending yourself against your country, I do think we in this country here really idealize that, and I don't think that that's a huge possibility. It does happen. It has happened. And Germany is the other example. And I've heard it said, like, if the Jews were all armed, things might have happened differently. They probably would have. That's actually a genuinely fair. Hitler would still have come for them, but it would have taken longer, and more of them would have, in the end, survived. But I would do what, in fact, you said I would do, which is I would say, okay, then let's just turn this into a numbers game and figure out what's the real likelihood that that's going to happen here in this country. How many lives are going to be saved by us being able to have, the armed civilian versus the number of lives that we lose up until that point, losing the 18,000 a year to murders, and then the percentage to accidents, and then a percentage to suicide, and yada, yada, yada. And I think the numbers come out very strongly for life is a lot better for everybody, and more people could come out on top if we don't have the guns. But I do think also the other argument that I have a tendency to make is, I keep getting told that we have freedom and we have democracy, and that's the greatest system in the world. But I also then keep getting told that we need to be afraid of the people we elect, because, yeah, we elected them, but they could turn on us at any minute. And I just, it does happen. I'm not going to sit there and say that hasn't happened, but it's just weird to hear those two arguments coming out of there. So I'm going to answer 40 Jake, and then if there's anything that you want to say, but I think I hope it's been interesting for everybody here. It was very interesting for me. I enjoy these discussions with you. Jake 4D, $2. What do you think of the Swiss approach to gun control? I'm actually going to use the Norway one. The Norway one is one of the ones I'd actually probably accept. I often offer it as a dare to people, and I have people who are very pro-gun. They're like, "Oh, why can't we do it?" It's like, okay, look, in Norway, they force you to have a gun. They come up to you and they say, "Here is a semi-automatic rifle that can be converted to automatic. If you don't take it, you go to jail." They pay for it. It's yours for free. They give you the ammunition for free. The reason is because they really do have a militia, and they have, in terms of defensive soldiers, 10 times as many as we do per square mile on there. Yeah, you're going to have a problem if you try to invade Norway. But they do have background checks on all of them. All the guns have ballistic screening. Nowadays, too, they're I don't know if they have added, but they're able to add the micro engraving on the bullets so that they know where the bullets came from, which is another one which, again, the NRA is against. It's like you can't even tell till somebody's fired the bullets. So I don't understand, unless you use the gun in a crime, there's no way, but they're against that, too. But at any rate, I'm just grousing. So what they do is, if somebody uses a gun in a crime in Norway, they know within 4 hours whose gun it was because they have a ballistics profile of every single weapon. And so they have people who can actually carry their rifles out in public. I think they've discouraged that now, but nonetheless, everybody's trained. Everybody has mental health screenings, and they are responsible. The other thing that I think we don't do in this state, and the NRA has been very, very good at stopping, and this is just insane. This is I get upset about this, and I suspect Isandering would actually be on my side on this one, which is if your gun is stolen, not because somebody really but because of your negligence, you just did nothing to secure it, and somebody steals it and uses it to go hurt someone, to go kill, you should be responsible. I'm sorry, you need to be responsible if you don't secure your weapon properly. And in Norway, that's the way it works. If we did that, the numbers that I've seen out of Norway, it works. They don't have mass shootings in Norway. The reason they don't have mass shootings in Norway is because they have strict gun control, and they have a gun in every house. But they control it, and it's reasonable, and it's common sense. And these guys, who as a country, their policy is, we're going to give you a semi-automatic weapon. It's NATO certified. You can switch it over to fully automatic. You can use the NATO rounds, the whole lot, because they're you're the militia now. And it works, but it works because they do the control that we refuse to do here. And if we're not going to do it here, then I think you got to get rid of all the guns. And I'd still rather be rid of the guns, but I would accept that as a compromise because it still achieves my goal, really. My goal is to just end the violence, and I've seen nothing so far that's really an honest proposal that's going to do that. But all right, Isandering, so we're wrapping up. Was there anything else you wanted to say before we go?
No, I think I agree with you on your assessment there.
All right. Well, thank you
all. I don't have anything to plug, so.
Okay, that's yeah. Well, I felt bad. I didn't ask you if you had any links or anything like that, and I realized you probably don't. So I don't. Normally it was just we ask. But thank you all for joining us. This was a significantly longer episode of In Time than usual, but absolutely worth it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Isandering, thank you for your patience, because I know you've been wanting to do this for a while, and I have too, and I'm glad we finally both stuck with it, because it took a long time.
I wish, you'd think I've been doing this for so long. I actually had a whole bunch of little notes and the specific statistics and things that I wanted. And then, of course, I leave them on my phone, which is the one device that I need to actually connect with and have up and I can't exit out because the last time I tried to exit out, it just shut everything down and try and bring up the other apps. And I should have put them on I should have thought of that. I don't know. It's driving around in all this heat. It's been cooking my brain, I guess. I should have had them on my tablet so that I could read them while I was looking at you. But because there were some specific statistics and specific numbers, because you brought up a bunch of those. And some of those graphs are actually graphs that I have downloaded, so I could look at them and reference the numbers. Because I ultimately do care about the numbers. And I don't believe that we can come to a rational approach to anything without having the numbers, and that applies to pretty much everything. I mean, I'm very upset that we don't track a lot of the stuff, with gun use that I think should be tracked. because I want the numbers for these things. Because if ultimately it comes out that this is such a huge, horrible negative, I would change my mind and I would support you, and let's get rid of all of the guns. But when I look at the actual numbers, yes, there's people do die, but it's not the epidemic that it's made out to be. I mean, 11,000 people murdered a year. Tragic, and I don't think that we should not do anything about it. We should look at, just because it's 14th down there on the list of things that are killing people in the country doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve to be looked at. I just think that people on both sides are politically motivated, making horrible arguments, and tend to be very hyperbolic. And I would like to see a lot more reasoned discussion with actual numbers to back things up.
Oh, I'm being hyperbolic, am I? I'm being unreal. Oh my God! I bring you on. We have this discussion, and you attack me personally right at the end of the show. I did kid gloves the whole time too.
Yes, you personally. You personally.
All right. Well, I agree with it.
All of that was directed directly at you, and no one else.
I deserve that. I deserve that. I'm a bad boy. All right. Well, no, and I like you had said too that it's not an epidemic, and it's true because I have thought of it very much as an epidemic, and I still think it's very, very serious. But I think that also is a phrase that merits some consideration, because damn it, you're not supposed to give up any good points. All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, Isandering, again. And you can give me your stats later. You know what? And maybe you can come back. We can have part 2. But
I'm sure everybody's sick and tired of listening to me talk about, we should have my guns. We should have my guns.
I will guess that most of our audience here has actually thoroughly enjoyed it, because I think, just like I said, I find it rare that it's someone who's actually just very reasonable, and it isn't really just about I love the guns, but this is how and why, and it's very reasoned, and we can have that. So,
don't get me wrong. I do love my guns. They are very fun. I go sporting with them whenever I'm at home. They are a lot of fun. There's lots of cool things to do with them. But that's not a compelling argument as to why I should have them.
Yeah, and I think that's and I do get that. So that's marvelous. I think, and by the way, anybody, I'll be in the Discord for a little bit. It's a little late. I'm going to have to get going, but I will. I don't know if you're going to be available. Did you want to come into? I forgot to. If you have time. Come into the Discord, be in the after show. I will be in the after show. We'll drop a link to the Discord in just a second, but we'll be down there, and you guys can have a chat with Isandering. He's available a lot anyway. So if you join our Discord, you'll see him there. Thank you all very much for those super chats. We really appreciate it. I'm sorry if I didn't get to all of them normally as quickly as I do. I ended up, this was had to be very present. So thank you all very much, and let's catch you in the Discord, or I think what's our next show? It's the Landon, and I think it's this Thursday. We're going to have Landon on. It says what the issue that was supposed to be. We changed issues, so I think it's Landon discussing the Supreme Court. So thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you guys again soon.
Good evening.